This morning, your destination for morning worship brought you to 28325 Kemptown Road in Damascus. But if you were to turn back the clock 175 years, you would instead be joining your church family for worship at Brown's Chapel, a small log church located on Brown's Church Road, about a mile and a half down the road on the right, in an area that is now part of Patuxent State Park. In 1844, a group of believers felt called to start Brown's Church, which was a non-denominational congregation. At first, they met in homes. Then, on November 28, 1846, 4 members of the Brown family bought 1 acre of land from the Watkins family and built Brown's Chapel, with members from both Montgomery and Howard counties. This dedicated group used their basic tools, non-power, and materials at hand to build a small log church heated with only a stove and lit by kerosene lamps. Quite a contrast to our sanctuary today. Congregants would have walked long distances to church, sometimes barefooted, and wore shoes only during the service. The pastor would have been itinerant, so not always there, but still the faithful who gathered would sing and worship, sometimes long past midnight. This dated stone remains and still marks the location of the original church. With a much more rural community and more limited opportunities to communicate with friends and neighbors on a daily basis, the church was an important means of connecting its congregation for worship, praise, and fellowship. The church remained non-denominational until deeded to Brown's Chapel Methodist Protestant Church, September 15th, 1860. So next time you drive by Brown's Church Road, picture a small group of believers, part of Montgomery Church's cloud of witnesses, coming together to grow in their faith and to leave as a legacy to their descendants a love of Jesus and a serving heart.
When our founders were meeting in their own homes and a log cabin, the Methodist Church was experiencing major changes. By 1860, the growth of new Methodists outnumbered the other 5 major denominations combined. Circuit riders introduced Methodism to the population wherever new settlements sprang up. This no doubt contributed to our church converting from non-denominational to the Methodist Protestant Church in 1860. During the Civil War, Methodists helped to free slaves via the Underground Railroad. After the war, Methodists helped to restore Southern churches that were damaged or destroyed. Methodist missionaries were active both at home and around the world. Over the years, several groups split off from the main body of the church. We joined the Methodist Protestant branch in 1860. Over the years, the Methodist Church and our Montgomery Church have seen a lot of changes. The chapel our founders built with their bare hands may no longer exist, but their journey of faith lives on through us.
We left our church forefathers worshiping at the little log chapel on Brown's Church Road. But as the church's population increased, the congregation eventually split in 2. The part of the congregation connected to our church built Montgomery Chapel in Cleggettsville, using lumber and labor from local farms. This would be the first church building connected to our congregation in this triangle of the intersection Route 27 and 80. Were you to visit the Montgomery Protestant Methodist Church, as it was called, you would recognize some of the elements and practices we still use today. Most of the furniture, such as the pulpit and pastor's chair, was hand-built by church members. The pulpit was known as the Sacred Desk and was built by George W. Easton. The pastor would have been a man, since women were not even admitted as General Conference delegates until 1892 and could not serve as clergy until 1956. To us, a service may seem long if it lasts much more than an hour. But then it was fashionable to hold a 2-week-long revival meeting. Men sat on one side of the aisle while women sat on the other. Like children today, the children of Montgomery Protestant Methodist Church would have attended Sunday school. Like today, music would have played an important part in worship. Musical instruments were at first considered sacrilegious, so a large choir sang a cappella until an organ was eventually purchased several years after the church was built. In 1884, the Browningsville Band was formed and entertained at the annual church picnic, a tradition that continues today. The Methodist Church embraced the temperance movement as a Christian virtue in 1880. Most Methodist churches began using grape juice symbolically during communion rather than wine, a practice that continues today. Since Methodist pastors often served multiple churches and were regularly reassigned, congregations provided fully furnished and appointed parsonages. The first parsonage associated with our church was located in Kemptown. In 1882, 3/4 of an acre of land was purchased and became the Montgomery Cemetery. Throughout the last half of this century, 1850 through 1900, the American Methodist Church quadrupled in size, and during the entire century, 1800 through 1900, the church grew exponentially 65 times. Just as the population of the area and the Methodist denomination grew, so did our church as it built a new house of worship, bought land for a cemetery, and joined with other area churches to build a parsonage.
When we last looked in on Montgomery Church, they were worshiping in a framed church building with an adjacent cemetery located in the triangle formed by Routes 27 and Route 80. The next 25 years would include a number of important milestones. Encouraged by their new pastor appointed in 1902, the congregation responded to his call to build a new church. They broke ground in 1904 for a church located very near to their old one. Most of the construction was accomplished by parishioners at a cost of approximately $4,000, and the church was dedicated a year later in 1905. As you leave our church today, look for the original 1904 cornerstone of that turn-of-the-century church, which today forms the base of a table in Montgomery's current vestibule. The foot pedal organ and some of the older furnishings from the previous building were moved to the new church. A lifetime church member donated a bell for the tall steeple of the 1904 church. That same bell now resides in our present bell tower and was functional until our steeple was blown off during a storm a few years back. Some of you have surely heard it chime. For the second time, Montgomery Church helped to provide a parsonage, once again in Kemptown. Although this parsonage was eventually sold as a personal residence, I knew it well as a child since I grew up living there in that home. At that time, the nicely furnished parsonage parlor was used for weddings since most people then were married in the church parlor rather than at the church. In fact, my in-laws were married in that same parlor in 1928. Picture those weddings as you enjoy the restored parsonage parlor seating, which today is used as part of our memorial room seating. Just as we continue to consider our faith in relationship to the social issues around us, so too did the congregation of the turn of the century Montgomery Church. At times, Montgomery's pastor would have preached sermons based on the Methodist doctrines of sanctification and perfection through Christ. Methodists were expected to abstain from social ills, such as gambling and intoxifying beverages, and temperance was a huge Methodist cause. As the Great War approached from 1914 to 1917, Methodist ministers would also have made strong pleas for world peace and professed pacifism from the pulpit. However, once the United States entered the war, the Methodist Church fully supported our troops. Our turn-of-the-century Montgomery church family continued their journey of faith in a prominent new church building, as together they faced the social issues and technological advances of their time through the lens of their faith.
In 1921, Montgomery Methodist Protestant Church was on a circuit which shared a pastor with Mountain View, Pleasant Grove, Kemptown, and Mount Lebanon. The frame church that Montgomery Methodist Protestant Church had dedicated in 1905 was now almost 15 years old, and so it was time for some improvements. In the early 1920s, many area congregations chose to replace their organs with pianos. Montgomery's fundraising efforts were quickly successful, and soon they too enjoyed the accompaniment of a piano in their worship. Originally, kerosene lantern chandeliers provided the only illumination for the church. Suspended on a cable, the kerosene chandeliers had to be raised and lowered alternately to have their wicks trimmed and their lamps filled with oil, which was quite a chore. The church itself was heated with only a wood stove. The congregation was surely delighted in 1926 when Potomac Edison ran electricity to the city of Damascus. Shortly thereafter, the church was wired for electricity and electric lights were installed. The heating system was upgraded as well. Another major set of improvements took place in 1941. Sunday school space was added to the building. The frame exterior was bricked and remains so today. And indoor plumbing replaced the his and her outhouses. Since the church steeple had begun to rot, Montgomery Church took off their steeple, leaving an open belfry. While the church building was growing and undergoing transformation, so too was the organization of the Methodist Protestant Church. In 1939, American Protestantism experienced the largest unification movement when the Southern Episcopal Methodist Church, the Episcopal Methodist Church, and the Methodist Protestant Church combined to form simply the Methodist Church. At the time of its formation, the new church included 7.7 million members. Just as we focus on outreach and mission today, so too did Montgomery's Ladies' Aid Society in 1936. To raise funds for their mission projects, they pieced together a quilt made from the embroidered signatures of sponsors who contributed $1 each to be a part of the project. The Montgomery Methodist congregation made it through the Great Depression, but now faced a coming worldwide conflict. As a denomination, Methodists continue to advocate for peaceful reconciliation among nations. But the vast majority of Methodists nonetheless strongly supported the national war effort in 1941 until the end of the war, at which time they turned their efforts to world peace and order again. The Methodist Church supported plans to establish a world organization to serve as a forum to resolve international problems and contributed their efforts to the founding of the United Nations in 1945. As World War II ended, Montgomery Methodist Church continued to worship together and pray for peace in their much improved church building at the corner of Routes 80 and 27.
Montgomery Methodist Church had received extensive improvement over the past decades, and now would also receive some interior upgrades as well as a new parsonage, which would house the pastoral study and church office. The new all-brick parsonage was started in 1948 and remained our parsonage until the late 90s, when it was sold as a personal residence to the daughter of a former pastor who still lives there today. In 1953, a church member donated a beautiful Hammond electric organ to enhance worship, and the first organist was our own Joyce Rhodes, who remains active in our music ministry today. In 1958, the Montgomery Church official bulletin documents the start of a 2-year expansion project. This provided a large area for wedding receptions and other social gatherings, plus several Sunday school rooms. Digging out the basement, placing foundation walls, pouring a floor, roofing, and divisions for the rooms all came to approximately $15,000. The exterior facade was improved again in 1960. The Klein family, in memory of their sons who had died while in military service, heightened the bell tower and provided a covering to shelter the bell. Great growth and change were also happening in the Methodist denomination itself. Full clergy rights were granted for women in 1956, and in 1968 the United Methodist Church was formed through a merger between the Evangelical Brethren and the Methodist Church USA. Our local church was also growing and changing. By the early 1960s, the men and women in the congregation were sitting together. In 1962, Montgomery United Methodist Church became a station, which meant it enjoyed a dedicated pastor. For many years, Montgomery Church held 3 annual dinners, each serving between 500 to 600 people, to help raise funds for the church. In the spirit of cooperation, all churches in the area held their dinners on different dates, so there were no conflicts. Initially, our dinners were held in the grove outside the church. During this time period, the community hall was used extensively to provide ample space for the annual dinners, banquets, wedding receptions, and other gatherings. Although after the July dinners, festivities continued in the grove with entertainment by the Browningsville Band and plenty of ice cream and watermelon for all to enjoy. The congregation also gathered every fall to produce between 100 to 150 gallons of apple butter, the proceeds of which contributed additional funds to the budget. But once again, the church was outgrowing its space, and so they purchased additional land near roads 27 and 80 to accommodate a building to house Sunday school rooms, a pastor's study, a kitchen, and a fellowship room. Fundraising began in earnest. Plans changed again in 1969 when it became apparent that a proposed Damascus bypass would pass within a few feet of the planned new building. The recently purchased land for the addition was sold, and several acres with access to Route 80 were purchased instead. However, it's been 50 years and there is still no bypass. And so began the planning for the campus Montgomery United Methodist Church enjoys today.
As we continue Montgomery's journey of faith, the faces and spaces will become increasingly familiar as the campus we enjoy today begins to take shape. By the early 1970s, Montgomery's congregation was actively working on plans for Phase 1 construction of a new multi-purpose building. The groundbreaking for the Educational and Fellowship Hall, as it was known, was in 1972, and the building was completed in time for VBS and the annual summer dinner the next year. It was consecrated in September 1973. The truly multi-purpose building served as gymnasium, dining hall for church dinners, and activities room. The Sunday school and nursery were pleased to move from their sometimes damp basement space at 27 and 80 into the new air-conditioned building. The new space hosted concerts sponsored by the Music Committee, special children's programs, and plays organized by the Education Committee, and church-wide parties and activities sponsored by the 50/50 Club. The carillon in the steeple of the Fellowship Hall provides Westminster chimes during the daylight hours and plays beautiful music every evening at 7 p.m. and mornings and evenings on Sundays. In late summer of 1974, the congregation began using the Fellowship Hall as a sanctuary for worship, using a grand piano donated by members to provide music for worship. In 1975, a con organ was added as well. However, special services such as weddings and funerals continued to take place in the building at 2780 until 1976, when a fire caused significant smoke and structural damage to the building. The fire-damaged building was eventually sold to the First Church of God. In 1984, Montgomery's Educational and Fellowship Hall classrooms became home of our accredited preschool, Montgomery Methodist Children's Center. Started as a ministry of the church, which provided the needed seed monies, the preschool has served as an enduring community outreach program that has also touched the lives of many of Montgomery's youngest members and their families. Judy Semenuk, the first preschool director, was followed by Donna Hill, who had to resign due to health issues, at which time Margaret Olson became the director. In 1988, we had sufficient funding to start Phase 2 construction planning for an additional building. The original vision called for continuing the Fellowship Hall building in a straight line, ending in a large sanctuary with 2 rows of seating and a wide central aisle. However, septic field considerations required a change to the current L-shaped design, and building code restrictions transformed our sanctuary design into one with a space shaped like a 1/4 pie with double aisles. In the late 1980s, the perennial need for additional storage space and more Sunday school rooms led to the planning of a frame building to be built out back. Most of the materials and labor were donated by the parishioners. In 1991, the youth group voted to keep the name of the building the Outback, and it is known as such today. For a time during the construction of the sanctuary under the building, the pastor's office was relocated to the Outback. Montgomery's large property allows for several meaningful outdoor spaces as well. Originally designed in the 1970s and dedicated in June 1981 in memory of James Gessling, the outdoor chapel has received a recent updating as part of an Eagle Scout project. For several years in the summer, the 8 a.m. Sunday worship services were held in the outdoor chapel. Our Fry Massey Pavilion is used for outdoor events. More recently, Montgomery has dedicated the Bills Trail on the east side of the property, which was created in memory of Bill Mihalis and Bill Wyatt, a former pastor. By the mid-90s, it was finally possible to provide for paid staffing in areas such as youth ministries, Christian education, congregational care, and an organist, all of which had previously been staffed by dedicated volunteers. Susie Tom, who had served our church for many years, became our first church office administrator. The congregation used their new spaces as a church home from which to share meaningful worship and spiritual growth experiences together, and to support multiple outreach ministries locally, nationally, and even internationally, just as Montgomery's congregation continues to do today.
Our journey of faith now begins to merge with that of Montgomery's spiritual ancestors. While the building fund was able to provide the buildings Montgomery uses today, the furnishings and interior design have been gradually fashioned and funded through the efforts of individuals, families, ministries, and fundraisers. You may have been a part of these efforts, which continue today and are made with the intent of enhancing worship and supporting ministries. Since the sanctuary is where we are in prayer, praise, and worship as a community, special care is always taken to provide meaningful visual support of our faith and traditions. For example, have you ever noticed the red lantern at the upper right side of the front sanctuary wall? Part of the original sanctuary design, it is known as the eternal light and is kept lit always to signify the light and presence of Christ with us every day and for all eternity. Our small chapel also has an eternal light. Montgomery continues to have a vibrant, ongoing music ministry to bring us together musically in praise and worship. Our Moeller pipe organ, dedicated in 1992, is a central part of the music ministry and is one of the best in the metropolitan area. While only 29 pipes are visible, there are 960 pipes behind the open grillwork and a MIDI electronic system that allows it to simulate the sounds of an entire orchestra. In addition to the beautiful music from organ and piano, we now also experience the joy of contemporary praise music led by our praise band. As you look around the sanctuary, you will see the two stained glass windows, which each depict a timeless passage from the book of Matthew. Come unto me, and go make disciples of all nations. Montgomery's pastor in 1991, Mark Derby, was integrally involved in the design of the windows so that each element has a rich symbolic meaning. You can read about the windows in detail in today's bulletin and then enjoy their symbolism and message each time you see them. Over the past several months, we have appreciated using some of the historical worship heirlooms left to us by Montgomery's past congregations as part of their journey of faith. As we recognize their witness and continue their journey, we make our own faith path for others to follow. For example, we enjoy using colorful ceramic offering plates in our services, which were made more recently by Montgomery Youth. And our Sunday school children today are led in song each Sunday to teach them the lessons and love of God, which we hope they will pass on to their children someday. Like those who came before us, we are also aware of the changing of liturgical seasons and their meaning for our personal spiritual growth through the changing colors of the paraments and banners carefully chosen and placed by members of our current worship committee. And so we leave our own legacy in many ways along our journey in faith together. We have been truly blessed by those who came before us with a beautiful church home and strong traditions that nurture our spiritual growth and better equip us to complete our mission to be ministers led by the Holy Spirit, to grow in faith, serve others, and share Jesus Christ with all to the glory of God. So let us continue our journey of faith today with gratitude and thanksgiving to Montgomery's cloud of witnesses going back 175 years as today we enter the mission field to touch the world with God's love, as we are called to do